Good morning, students. Welcome to Medha IAS Academy. My name is Gowtham. I am a faculty for Political Science and International Relations, as well as faculty for General Studies Paper 2 in Civil Service Mains, which includes Indian Polity, Governance and International Relations, India's Foreign Policy. Today, we are going to discuss a very important topic, which has done a lot of rounds in terms of academic circles as a part of deliberations, discussions, debates, and that is the concept of trade tariffs and whether these tariffs are leading to trade wars or not. What exactly are tariffs? What was the history of tariffs? What was the experiences of the international system on tariffs and their imposition? How tariffs are going to impact? And how the recent tariffs imposed by the American President Donald Trump is impacting both the American economy as well as the global economy. All these are a few issues that we will be discussing as a part of today's lecture. To begin with, trade was continuously considered to be an important element of international relations. Right from the 19th century itself, when modern nation states have evolved and have settled, trade among the nation states became a routine affair. A lot of countries began to engage in trade practices with other states, and several norms and rules of trade engagements also were established. However, it was from the beginnings of the 20th century that trade began to become a contentious issue. When countries began to adopt protectionist measures, when countries began to discourage imports from other countries, when countries began to impose non-tariff barriers as well as other obstacles to smooth flow of trade, this was when trade as an issue in international relations became contentious. It became a matter of conflictual aspect of international system as well. You know that after America emerged as the most powerful nation, America began to dominate the international trade and its flows. America was the world's largest manufacturing hub, as well as America was the country which was having the largest trade relations with almost all the regions by the early years of the 20th century. However, after the end of the First World War, a lot of countries began to adopt protectionist measures, began to impose barriers, including, of course, United States of America. US, which was one of the world's largest manufacturing hub, continued to have adverse trade relations. In spite of the fact that it was producing the largest number of goods, America began to have adverse trade relations because America had a very large amount of import. And this import was required by America for sustaining its domestic industrialization as well. Raw materials, industrial components, intermediary goods, plant and machinery were all imported by US. Therefore, there was very high incidence of American import. America always continued to feel that American tariff system is putting American trade relations with other countries at a disadvantage. Therefore, America had started the history of using tariff as a tool to control trade relations and to control trade flows. In recent times also, we had seen Donald Trump imposed a lot of tariffs on other countries. President Donald Trump had imposed tariffs on goods starting from a base tariff to different or differential tariff rates on various countries based on its trade relations, the incidence of its trade with that country, and so forth. Donald Trump continues to argue that imposition of tariffs is going to better America's trade relations, reduce American trade deficit, will give a boost to American industrialization, will strengthen the employment sector in US, and will, of course, deter all the other countries who are engaging in immoral trade practices against US to be regularized. Now, all these are arguments which are being put forward by the American President Donald Trump for this trade tariffs that he had imposed on other countries. However, a lot of critics begin to argue that tariffs which are imposed by Donald Trump on imports is also going to have an adverse impact on American growth trajectory as well. Critics warn, would lead to higher prices. We had also seen a slightly higher rate of inflation in US after tariffs kicked in. It would also lead to a damage of the global economy, primarily because it is going to disrupt trade flows. And America, as I told you, is one of the largest trading partners with almost all the regions of the world. And that is definitely going to be affected. It is definitely going to disrupt free flow of trade as well as damage the global economy. A good number of experts also have begun to forecast or predict a reduction in global growth rate because of the tariffs imposed by the American president. Now, there are also several other legal issues related to the imposition of tariffs by the American president. Supreme Court of America had expressed certain concerns about the legality of the tariffs imposed by American president. Now, we'll look at all these things in a few details now. A lot of experts feel that the present wave of or new protectionism which we are seeing is a part of a broader trend called de-globalization, which had begun from 2014 and which is continuing today. Even now also we see, according to a good number of strategic experts, a phase of de-globalization. There was a phase earlier from the middle of 1980s till around 2008-9 when we had seen what was called as hyper-globalism. When almost all the countries across the entire world wanted to get onto the bandwagon of globalization, get benefits out of this process. And a good number of countries also, though they were beginning to feel the threat of globalization, also looked at the brighter side of the potential advantages that globalization could offer. Therefore, that period between the middle of 1980s till around 2008 and 2009 is considered to be a phase of hyper-globalization. Later, from 2008-9 till about 2015 onwards, we had seen a slowdown in the process of globalization. Countries were a little more hesitant to become a part of globalization, and therefore the process of globalization had slowed down, which was called by some experts as globalization. However, from 2015 onwards, 2014-15 onwards, till this day, we have seen what was called by several experts as de-globalization. It means countries are now more cautious, more measured in being participants in the process of globalization. In fact, there have been a good number of countries which have instituted new controls and new regulatory regimes and mechanisms on their trade activities. Protectionist measures are also being adopted by a good number of countries to regulate trade. And tariffs can be seen as a part of those protectionist measures. As we discussed a few minutes earlier, Donald Trump continued to insist that tariffs were being imposed by US primarily to discourage imports, primarily to protect the domestic industry, primarily to bring back the American industry and investments, to enhance employment opportunities for the American locals. Now, these are several arguments which are being put forward by Donald Trump in support of his imposition of tariffs. Now, what exactly are, or how do we exactly understand what are tariffs? Tariffs are nothing but taxes imposed on imported goods. Taxes are imposed on imported goods. And usually, tariff is expressed as a percentage of the total goods value. For example, if there is a good which is valued at, let's say, $10, if there is a tariff of 10%, the total value of the good after the tariff regime would be $11. So, a good valued at $10 subjected to a tariff of 10% will ultimately be priced or valued at $11. Therefore, the imposition of a tariff increases the price of a good. The imposition of tariffs will actually make the good a little more uncompetitive, or will make the good lose its price advantage in the market. Therefore, according to a good number of experts, the imposition of tariff on goods is a disincentive for importers in a country, because their imports in that country would become uncompetitive owing to higher prices. Now, this is the impact primarily of tariffs. Now, the tariff, as I told you, is a tax paid on the imports, and this is a revenue to the government. Companies pay this tax to the government, which becomes a part and parcel of the government's revenue. Therefore, tariffs imposed on imported goods will also contribute to the national exchequer. As a part of the new tariff policy imposed by Donald Trump, it is estimated that US had raised around $25 billion, approximately around $25 billion in the year 2025. So, tariffs obviously are going to increase the price of good, and therefore it is a disincentive to importers. And tariffs actually may result in the cost of the tariff being passed on as extra cost to their customers, to the consumers, to the business or organizations which make those imports. The tariffs will be more costly to the products which they consume or which they import. Therefore, the price of tariffs is going to be shifted onto ordinary citizens as well as other business groups. That's the reason why it is said that tariffs may lead to higher costs in US. Okay, so these are primarily the consequences of tariffs, or let's say the adverse consequences of tariffs. So tariff may result in some revenue to the government, but tariff may, in the long run, be a burden which is going to be shifted onto the heads of the ordinary consumers, the ordinary citizens, as well as the local business groups which are importing components or raw materials as a part of their production process. So this is how tariffs are going to be affected. Now what about the history of tariffs in America? As I told you, in the interwar period, but that is between the First and the Second World War, as America began to emerge as the global leader in terms of both manufacturing of goods and merchandise as well as establishment of trade relations. In both these aspects, America emerged as a global leader by the early 1920s. And America began to adopt protectionist measures. The first measure that was adopted by America was what was very famously called as the Fordney-McCumber Law, Fordney-McCumber Tariff Law, which came into implementation in 1922. Now this primarily was intended to protect the American farmers and the American manufacturers after the First World War. After the First World War, the war-ravaged economies began to focus more on exports to realize a greater revenue, and that was the time when it was felt by a good number of governments that they should raise their revenue through exports. And this led to adoption of certain unfair trade practices by some countries, and therefore America, to overcome that, had imposed this protectionist measure called the Fordney-McCumber Tariff Law in 1922. Primarily, as I told you, this law was intended for protection of the American farmers and small business organizations or manufacturers. Now, this law, in fact, established very, very high tariff rates, averaging around 40%. So, 40% tariff across several goods were imposed by America through this law. So, it was an instance of very high tariff rate imposed by US. Second and more famous of the tariff law that was imposed was the US Smoot-Hawley Tariff Law of 1930. Now, this also was in the form of a protectionist measure, and this was imposed across 20,000 goods that were being imported into America. And this also primarily was intended for protection of American farmers as well as American small and medium scale manufacturers against imports at the time of the Great Economic Depression of 1929 and 30. You know that we had the Great Economic Depression in 1929 and 30, and to protect the American manufacturers and farmers from imports, this law was passed in America. These two laws were the basis for the protectionist measures that were adopted by America, which was by then the most powerful economy in the whole world, felt that it should protect its farmers and small and medium businessmen, and therefore it imposed these tariffs. The imposition of these tariffs led to conflicts. It led to economic downturn because it disrupted trade, and that would definitely bring down the productivity, leading to an economic downturn. Also, it triggered retaliatory tariffs. A good number of countries, in retaliation to the tariffs imposed by US, began to also, from their side, impose retaliatory or what were called as reciprocatory tariffs. That led to trade wars. Countries therefore began to engage in trade wars. These were probably the very first economic wars that countries began to engage in. Conflict because of the tariffs that were being imposed on trade, or to regulate the flow and incidence of trade. A good number of countries began to adopt these practices, predatory tariffs leading to trade wars, and the policy at that time was very popularly called as beggar thy neighbor policy. It means countries adopting policies which are deliberately intended for subjecting another country to a disadvantage, economic disadvantage, or hurting an economic interest of another country, even to the extent of hurting the economic vitals of that country sometimes. Such type of policies were called as beggar thy neighbor policies. making your neighbor or your neighboring country or your trade partner, more impoverished because of the adverse trade laws that you have adopted. This led to drastic reduction of international trade. So disruption of trade, trade wars, the Great Economic Depression, all these things were interconnected. So beginning with the protectionist measures, tariffs imposed by various countries, leading to trade wars, disruption of economic activities, and disruption of trade, leading to loss of employment, loss of opportunities, countries being wound up. All these ultimately reinforced the Great Economic Depression that the world experienced between 1929 and 1930. Therefore, tariffs always have another angle. They can lead to trade wars, they can disrupt trade, they can sometimes even lead to breakdown of the international economic system. Please remember that liberal international economic order considers trade as a tool for building bridges, trade as a means to create a relationship of interdependence which can reduce conflict. However, the very tool called trade came to be regulated or controlled through the tariff policies adopted by various countries. Now, these tariff policies became predatory and led to conflicts and trade wars. Therefore, trade which was conceived as a tool for building bridges is now becoming a tool for conflict, becoming a tool through which one country began to adopt what were very famously called as beggar thy neighbor policies. So all these have reinforced the enmities, have created mistrust, and have become another reason for the general conflictual environment in the interwar period, which also contributed in one way or another to the outbreak of the Second World War. This could be a drastic influence or catastrophic influence that tariffs and tariff policies can have on relations between countries. Now, after looking at the history of tariffs, now let us try and come down to the tariffs that were imposed in 2025 by Donald Trump. Donald Trump contested the elections with the promise of making America great again. He proposes to do this by bringing back to America the manufacturing base, which had actually shifted away from America over several decades. Now, Donald Trump seeks to bring back the American manufacturing base as a reshore process to America. So, reshoring the manufacturing base was one of the promises made by Donald Trump to realize the ideal of Make America Great Again, MAGA. So, he, as a part of that, argued that tariffs will increase tax revenue. Obviously, government's revenue will increase. And I told you that in 2025, American tax revenue through tariffs experienced a surge to an extent of nearly $25 billion. And secondly, he also argued that tariffs will encourage American-made goods because imported goods will become less competitive owing to the higher prices, which the companies will have to present because of the tariff they'll have to pay. Therefore, American goods will become more competitive. It will also boost investments in US. Now, how is that going to happen? Because importing goods to America will become more costly, companies will try to relocate themselves in America so that their goods will become domestically produced goods, and thus investments can increase in US. That was his logic. So by discouraging imports, you can actually relocate the companies back in America. So that is bringing back investments, and that is his idea of making America great again, reshoring the manufacturing base back to America. It will also reduce US trade deficit. Please remember that it is US which has one of the largest trade deficit in the entire world. With almost all the regions, US has a trade deficit. It means the value of US imports far exceeds the value of US exports, which is leading to a trade deficit which US may have to finance through its currency. This trade deficit had become one big factor for adverse trade relations that US has with other countries, even with a country like India, for example. Among the top 10 trading partners that India has, US is the only country with which India has trade surplus. With all the other countries, India has tremendous trade deficit. Not only with respect to India, with respect to many countries and many regions across the entire world, America has a lot of trade deficit. Therefore, by imposing tariffs, imports can be discouraged, and therefore the deficit can be rationalized or reduced or moderated, according to Donald Trump. Donald Trump also argues that the other countries have been subjecting America to a very high incidence of tariffs. He in fact went to the extent of saying that India imposes 100% tariffs on American imports on some goods. India, he declared, was a tariff king. And Donald Trump used choicest words to try and impress upon his people that US is being exploited. He here conveniently forgets the fact that a large amount of US industrialization is based on the import of raw materials, import of industrial components, import of the intermediate goods, etc. Therefore, American industrialization also requires imports, particularly the imports from the North Atlantic region. America has entered into a North Atlantic free trade agreement with countries like Canada and Mexico. And imports from Canada and Mexico constitute a large part of American industrialization process. American industry requires these components, these raw materials from these North Atlantic countries. So America has always insisted under Donald Trump on the high imports that other countries are bringing into America, here conveniently forgetting the fact that even American industrialization also requires these imports. So to sustain industrialization, America requires these imports, these industrial components, which America imports from its other countries. China, for example, Canada, Mexico are three largest trading partners of US, and the imports from these countries is absolutely essential for America to sustain its industrialization. However, Donald Trump argues that US has been exploited by cheaters and pillaged by foreigners. Now, these are the choicest words that he is using against his trading partners. He is calling them as cheaters, or he is saying that America is being pillaged or America is being exploited through high tariff rates which are being imposed by other countries. Donald Trump also has made use of tariffs to make other demands on countries. For example,